Oh, it's recording. Should I start? Welcome, everybody. We're doing our presentation on chronic traumatic encephalopathy, also known as CTE. I'm David Daniel.
Jeremy Stanton.
Juan Seja.
Julia Moore.
And I'm Sean Flood.
CTE is a degenerative brain disease commonly found in athletes that originates from trauma in the brain. CTE occurs when the protein hyperpolated tau malfunction and causes a chain reaction in other parts of the brain. This results in damages and kills brain cells. The symptoms include difficulty thinking, uncontrollable behavior, depression, impulse control problems, aggression, mood swings, paranoia, short-term memory loss, dementia, confusion, impaired judgment, and could lead to substance abuse. CT typically results from suffering hundreds of some consecutive hits to the head. It is commonly found in football players, hockey players, rugby players, and boxers, and any other contact sport that requires headshots or any physical activity. How CTE is diagnosed. CTE can only be officially diagnosed after they die. Doctors who specialize in brain disease use chemicals on the brain to reveal the tau protein. The doctors then observe the abnormalities of the tau protein and the pattern it is aligned to diagnose CTE. The process of properly diagnosing CTE can take months, and a few doctors haven't known how to solve this till the past decade because it's fairly a new disease to sports. Aaron Hernandez is one of the most commonly cases for CTE and the most severe case of CTE at his age at only 27 years old. This led to the downfall of his NFL career and his life. Hernandez was a former football player in the NFL, known for playing for the Patriots. He hung himself back in 2017 during a life sentence in prison for committing a murder back in 2013. After further research on his brain, doctors found out he had stage 3 of CTE, which was the most severe stage for a person at that age and the most severe case they've ever seen. In Aaron's research case, they headline how football players take a toll on their body and especially their brain because all the hard tackling and all the headshots they take during games. Reviewing pictures of his brain showed black spots of the tau protein and on his brain and had significant damage to his brain that may have caused his decision making. As we could tell by the diagram, this is a normal 27-year-old's brain, and the other one is Aaron's brain. As you can see, all the black spots around the brain that has taken a lot of damage to it, and it doesn't look like a normal brain. And then you could tell from all the headshots that he took.
As far as Aaron Hernandez's early life, he had a very traumatic upbringing. His family detailed in his biography how he was sexually abused as a child, and his mother and siblings were all physically abused by his father. After Aaron's father's death in high school, he reportedly started using drugs at just 17 years old. He also had several violent public altercations, like bar fights, also at 17. Though evidence of CTE was found in Hernandez's brain, some think there were earlier warning signs of depression in Aaron throughout his life. He did play football his entire life, so it's hard to say what actions could have been from the neurodegenerative disease and what may have been from his own physiological makeup aside from the CTE alone. Either way, Aaron did display symptoms of irritability, severe mood swings, fits of rage, and went on to express suicidal ideations in his journal before he took his own life in 2017. And according to Dr. Turner's lecture on depression, These are all symptoms of mental illness. Either way, Aaron displayed symptoms of mental illness, and CTA may have had an effect on that, or because of his young death, they were able to study this earlier than most people in his age group. It's very hard to diagnose because the late progression of CTE usually takes over 8 to 10 years after head trauma when Aaron was still playing in the NFL. Studies find that depression rates in former NFL players are significantly higher than healthy control groups. And the older the participants are, the more prevalent signs of depression become. So again, harder to find it in Aaron, but the repetitive head impact is how they study that in former players, and post-mortem studies are the most helpful. So that's why he was able to be a good example of the CTE's effects.
The physiology aspect of CTE in the brain. CTE is a syndrome that manifests with behavioral disturbance and cognitive decline in patients who suffer from repeated head trauma, and a lot of the symptoms are really similar to depression, and athletes who have CTE typically have depression as well, or are thought to have depression because the symptoms are so similar. Researchers at Boston University found that Aaron Hernandez had significant damage to his frontal lobe and his amygdala, and Junior Seau was also found to have damage to his frontal lobe. And this is really important because the frontal lobe is responsible for problem solving, judgment, impulse control, and social behavior. And the amygdala produces emotional regulation, emotional behavior, and is the fear and anxiety centers of your brain. And so this could explain a lot of their personality changes later in life, and ultimately what led to a lot of their decisions that they made after their NFL careers.
So after touching on what parts of the brain each Junior Seau and Aaron Hernandez had, you can kind of just tell by the positions that they played. Like, for example, Aaron Hernandez was a tight end, so he was getting hit as well as, fighting for extra yards and, tackling through people or running through people. Whereas Junior Seau, I'll see you later. I'm sorry. Whereas Junior Seau was a linebacker, and his primary damage was in his frontal lobe, which is, he was always tackling. He wasn't getting tackled, so he was doing the tackling. And so San Diego legend Tiani Bao Junior Seau, also known as Junior Seau, tragically took his own life on May 2nd, 2012, after shooting himself in the heart. Seau suffered from CTE and depression due to countless blows of the head. Like those other unfortunate players who suffer from the disease, Seau was searching for answers to why he was feeling and behaving the way he was. After a 20-year career, it was just 2 years after Seau retired from the NFL when he tragically took his own life. Seau left his mark on the game forever, nicknamed the Tasmanian Devil because his playing style was extremely destructive and he always made his presence known. Very much like the cartoon character. His heart on the field and love for the game solidified himself as one of the premier linebackers in NFL history.
Junior Seau, after they studied his brain and cut it open after he passed away, they found that the tau protein and scattered glial tangles were found in the sulcal depths of the frontal and superior temporal cortex. And this just shows that he had significant damage to his frontal lobe, and a lot of the damage was focused on this part of his brain. And his brain was also smaller. And if you remember the pictures from Aaron Hernandez's brain, you can see that the cerebral cortex is a lot larger. And so it's really impinging upon the inner part of their brain and is adding to this cognitive decline. His family and friends reported that Junior Seau had surprising behavioral changes that included withdrawal, heavy alcohol consumption, reckless business and financial decisions, and gambling. And a lot of these behaviors are similar to those of depression and mania. And a lot of these actions and the results of CTE could have led to both Aaron Hernandez and Junior Seau's cognitive dysfunction, and ultimately to both of them taking their lives.
When Junior Seau took his life, it was clear he had intentions of helping to find answers to what at the time seemed to be a fairly new disease. Seau wanted his brain to go towards research and studies for the disease, which is why he unfortunately decided to shoot himself in the heart. But this just goes to show how selfless of a person Seau truly was. Although some may argue that the action of taking his own life is selfish in itself, no one would ever want to go through a life with such mentally drastic altercations and having no idea how or why. Just hours after Seau's death, dozens of research facilities contacted the Seau family with efforts of trying to acquire his brain for research. After much debate and research, they eventually decided to donate his brain to the NIH, which according to an article on ESPN states, the NFL, both directly and in partnership with the NIH, Centers for Disease Control, and other leading organizations, is committed to supporting a wide range of independent medical and scientific research that will both address CTE and promote the long-term health and safety of athletes at all levels.
So like previously mentioned, the knowledge of CTE was pretty non-existent until roughly the last decade or so, mainly within the last 5 to 6 years. In 2015, Dr. Ann McKee and her team of researchers at the VA BU CLF Brain Bank collaborated with the National Institution of Health to help develop a criteria to properly diagnose CTE. This criteria helped the knowledge of CTE vastly. It was made so any neuropathologist can identify CTE, and this discovery made it so that as long as the doctor is able to know the parts of the brain and functions, they could identify how built in the brain. That way they can identify the patterns and the abnormalities, and then they could properly diagnose CTE.
The NFL has changed immensely over the years in terms of rules and regulations created to help protect players, along with constantly focusing on how equipment can be improved. Entire CTE research facilities have been created. The NFL recently contributed $40 million towards medical research with the focus on neuroscience, data-driven rule changes to end dangerous game tactics and make injuries less likely.
Continuing off that, the money put forward has been put towards new guidelines, medical support, and technology used to identify, diagnose, and treat concussions and many other injuries. Players and the medical personnel alike are now required to attend mandatory health and safety education, where they understand what they're signing for when they choose to enter the field, court, whatever it may be, whenever they sign up for that sport, or that way they could properly identify and keep the players safe. New rules for protective equipment are being put in place. Some examples can be seen within helmet companies like Schutt and Rydell are constantly making new iterations of their helmets, trying to constantly improve upon the last design, whether it puts more right where the frontal lobe may be, or maybe it's just another little strap back. They're constantly trying to do every single little thing they can that way to reduce the amount of concussions that happen. And also, scientists are looking at how certain genes could possibly make a person more liable to get a buildup of tau proteins in the brain. So rather than getting the tau protein buildup from repeated head trauma, they're now starting to look into if they could be something that could be linked genetically. That way they could identify someone who's at risk for CTE before they even acquire it. So with the culture of CTE in football, in the past, concussions and head trauma and high contact sports have been brushed aside when it comes to severity of the injury. In football, it's expected that you're going to go out there and hit your head. So when you get a concussion, people just don't think much of it. You just keep going on with the next day. The masculine culture of sports has led to a common theme of athletes trying to shake off injuries that way they can continue to play, thus resulting in further damage. They may have their own ulterior motives when it why they continue to play after clearly hitting their head pretty hard. But I mean, it could go from anything to being a high school player trying to get a scholarship to play college football, or it could be the NFL player barely on the roster who wants to make sure they get a paycheck. But with that being said, the culture is changing. As more and more NFL players retire at age for fear of developing CTE, it helps put all the other players on notice too, and helps spread the knowledge of the disease. The NFL is no longer ignoring the fact that brain damage is a big part of the sport, and they are contributing to help finding cures and preventative measures. That way they can keep the sport running in a safe manner. So with CTE in the NFL, there's statistics that show just how severe it is on the daily basis. In 2019, a study was conducted on the brains of 223 football players with CTE, 43 players without CTE. It was found that for each additional 2.6 years of playing football, developing CTE doubled. Another study showed that 111 brains that were donated from the NFL to CTE research, 110 of them were officially diagnosed with CTE. In 2012, a study of 3,409 NFL players with 5 or more years of experience in the NFL, their neurodegenerative mortality was 3 times that of the general US population and 4 times higher than 2 specific subcategories: Alzheimer's disease, and Lou Gehrig's disease. Other studies found that NFL concussions were more likely to live with things such as depression, dementia-related syndromes, Lou Gehrig's disease, and erectile dysfunction.
Personally, for me, I chose to do my research on CT specifically in the NFL because I played competitive soccer for 14 years. And in that time, I got at least 7 concussions, probably more, but I fell into that culture of, toughing it out and not really saying anything when my head was hurting or when I knew for sure I had a concussion, but I didn't want to reduce my playing time, and I didn't want my parents or my coaches to know how severe my pain was. And I ultimately stopped going to my concussion doctor because I knew he would make me stop playing, and I had intended on playing in college, but obviously that's not working out. But at the time, I would regularly get my brain scanned to see if there was any significant damage. Every year we would take concussion tests. We had a baseline, and then we would see how we progressed from there to see if we were getting worse or if we were getting better, and how our cognitive abilities had changed. Ever since then, I have still been suffering from some of my symptoms of my concussions, and my last one was over 2 years ago. I still have a lot of memory loss. I have reduced concentration times. I still am really sensitive to light and sound, and so I can only imagine like what CTE is happening with all these football players and how much more significant their damage is in their brain. And it's really fascinating to me how brain injuries can really significantly alter someone's personality and their cognitive functioning years down the line.
So, growing up playing football, getting long-term brain damage was definitely not on my list of worries. But after gaining awareness and just realizing that this is a very real disease, and even just from this just happened just from watching Will Smith's movie Concussion. I quit playing football the next year, and I think it was the right decision to quit because who knows what my struggles today could have been. Just like Julia said, she had a concussion over 2 years ago. I could have been playing football within that like 5 year span, and very easily could have gotten a couple concussions. And so, I'm grateful I made the right decision. I still have friends today that are struggling from the injuries that they got in football. Like one of my friends struggles with memory loss, mood swings. He even says that, he gets seizures every now and then. So that was very concerning to hear from him. Yeah, it's definitely a very real disease, and I'm glad we're spreading awareness for it, and finally doing something about it, because it's crazy to think that 20 years ago these guys were trying to kill each other on the field, and now we've came a long way. So
Yeah, and then also playing football the majority of my life, like I felt the strain on my body and I've seen the strain that happens on my teammates. Luckily for me, I've only had a single concussion throughout my experiences. But however, I have seen one of my best friends basically have to come to the football team and tell us that he was no longer going to be able to suit up and play with us anymore due to repeated head trauma because of football. He suffered concussions, and just like that, his football career was over halfway through high school. But that really put things into perspective for me. I never really thought anything of it. I was just out there playing football after school, being with my friends, having a good time. But there really were out there risking our health just for a game. And seeing my friend have to go through that really put into perspective of how severe, like how delicate the brain was and how severe damage to it could be. I wanted to do this topic that way we could learn more about it. I want the knowledge of CTE to continue to grow and further on. I mean, I enjoyed playing football. I enjoyed my time with it. I would love for it to be a safe way for it to be played without the worries of major brain trauma affecting people in the future.